Hello, listeners. This is From Ideology to Unity. I have Chris Tazreiter here. And what's your podcast called?
My podcast is called A PhD and Me.
Could you explain how you came up with that name then?
Well, it's the title of a book that I've just published with the same name. And it's the book and the podcast and the message attached to them are an invitation for people to embark, I guess, on a journey similar to what I am on, which is a journey of letting go of all of the learned beliefs that were put into me as a child, of disconnecting from social consciousness, and I guess through an insatiable curiosity, questioning everything and discovering and coming up with the answers and the beliefs that come from the inside, from me. So rather than those that were spoon-fed to me by, whether it be politics or religion or academia and whatever else, I'm that the PhD in me is a unique and individual journey of discovering the answers that to the questions that we all have inside of us, rather than just accepting the cultural and societal spoon-fed answers.
Okay, that's interesting. So how did you start to question what you've been taught?
Do you know, it's funny. I feel like that life and the universe has used me as a guinea pig or as a lab rat, because I was born in a European country into a very traditional Catholic upbringing, and with all of the dogma attached to organized religion. And then I was exposed to science like everybody else, and was taught Newtonian physics, and which said that the universe is made up of matter and everything is measurable. And none of the stories that I was told completely made sense to me. The idea that there's an old man with a white beard sitting up there with an iPad keeping score of all the things that we did wrong and whatever else just somehow didn't fit completely. And then, with classical physics, the problem was that it said we can measure everything from the Big Bang till now, but we need you to give us one miracle because we can't actually explain the Big Bang and what that was and where it came from and whatever else. So that didn't totally make sense either. And at some point, I just started to question things more and more, and I let go of organized religion and discovered spirituality. And I let go of what I was taught in classical Newtonian physics and science and discovered quantum physics. And the more I studied the inner science of spirituality and the outer science of quantum physics, the more I discovered that they started to converge and they started to tell the same story. And that was so fascinating, because the story that they were both telling me anyway was that we don't live in a mechanical universe, that we live in a universe made of consciousness and energy. And that's what we are, consciousness and energy. And so that journey continues, and the expansion of my awareness and my understanding continues unabated. And the book, I guess, is an invitation for those people who resonate with it and who feel an impulse inside them that says all the stuff I've been told and taught somehow is incomplete. And the PhD in me has a thesis at its core, and the thesis is that everything I was taught as a child growing up was either completely false or only partially true. And I have not found anything yet that doesn't fit into that category, that wasn't, either false or at best only a part of the truth.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, because when I looked into quantum physics, at least when I started to open my mind about it, I started seeing connections between quantum physics and mysticism. And so I can definitely see how your journey came about like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and you said something there that is really, really important, and it's the word open mind,
yeah.
because there's such a clear distinction between an open mind and a closed mind. When new information comes at a closed mind, it will look at the source of that information and either automatically accept it or reject it based on whether the source of the information is a trusted source or not.
Oh, yeah.
And it will also accept or reject the information based on whether it fits into the learned beliefs of that mind. So the information goes through the filters of that person's unique beliefs. And in a closed mind, if it doesn't fit, it just simply bounces off and is just automatically rejected as wrong or as rubbish or as impossible. Whereas what I've observed in me is that with an open mind, I don't, any new information that comes towards me, I don't automatically accept anything and I don't automatically reject anything. So it goes through a process of sitting with that information, evaluating it. And the funny thing is that if it is meant to be my truth, it will reappear from other sources and different sources. And the other thing that I felt on this learning journey, and I guess this comes from an understanding that there is an essence, a consciousness that lives inside of me, is that when something appears in my awareness and in my consciousness that I had not previously been exposed to, there are times when it feels so true, but it doesn't feel like I'm learning something new. It feels like I'm remembering something that I already knew beforehand. And that's a
That's
really cool feeling.
that's fascinating. The idea that you're remembering it, because
Yeah.
in mysticism, there's this idea of the Akashic records. There's
Yes.
this idea of the veil of forgetting.
Yes.
So it may well actually be that you're remembering it.
Yes.
And then that's a really interesting way of looking at it. Would you say it's synchronicity when it comes up repeatedly, this new idea?
Yes, and in fact, in the last couple of years, I have come to recognize so many synchronicities in my life and guiding my journey, and things that just amaze me, that the things that happen as synchronicities. So yes.
Yeah. So could you give an example of a synchronicity you got perhaps
Well,
this week?
I'll give you an example of one which was so profound that I actually put it in the book. Um, So the work that I was doing a few years ago, I had occasion to be at a nursing home, and I was there doing some work, and I came out and got into my van and pulled out of the car park. And as I started to drive off, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. And the funny thing was that that morning, as I got up, I found myself to be strangely cranky. And normally I have this wonderful inner peace. I have very little stress in my life these days. And I just happened to be cranky that morning. And I sort of, said to myself, gee, I must have put on my cranky pants today. And so I was pulling out of this car park and there was a number plate. And in with our number plates here, they often have a message in them, but because they have a limited number of characters, the message is often abbreviated. And the message was LT1TGO, which stands for Let It Go. LT1TGO, right? And so
Wow.
there was this amazing feeling, oh my God, I'm just getting this message just to let it go. And then I started to drive off and I thought, did I just see what I thought I saw? And I was already on the road and I I had to go back. So I turned around, drove in again, and right next to the car that had that number plate on it was a number plate with the Chris written on it. So these two
Oh,
cars were sitting next to each other. One said "Let it go," and the other one said "Chris." So this was in a
oh,
capital city. And the funny thing was, I got home and I told my wife about it, and she said, "Did you photograph them?" I thought, "Oh no, I forgot." And so I set the intention to find those cars again. And within the next week, I found both cars and photographed them. The only thing was they weren't parked next to each other, but I got led back to both of them. And but what emerged is that that message wasn't just about me that morning letting go whatever was making me cranky, but I came to realize that it's one of the most fundamental messages for us as we experience life, because we have so many experiences, so many traumas, so many things that we don't complete and that we don't allow ourselves to feel. And so we hold them inside and we store them, and they become stored energy. And if you can ask somebody, how heavy is your life, and the question basically means how many experiences and traumas have you had that you have not allowed yourself to complete and to let go. And so it was a hugely valuable message, and an amazing synchronicity, for me to see those two cars parked next to each other, and then for the meaning of that message to emerge to a point where it became a really important part of the book.
yeah, that's almost magical, really. What
Yeah,
probably is.
yeah. Well, that's what
So,
synchronicities are.
yeah, that's synchronicity. So, I've got a question. So, when it comes to letting go, how do you process what you're holding on to so that you can let it go?
So, I mean, there are so many different ways to answer that question, and in a lot of ways, it depends on where a person is at in their journey and in their beliefs at that particular time, right? So a lot of the time, it's helpful to have somebody to help you with that process, and for somebody, like, nobody can find the answers to the questions and the things that you're looking for, but people can help and guide you on that journey. But I guess the first intuitive answer that comes up for me is to set the intention to do that, right? And then allow the process. So our logical
Okay.
mind thinks there's stuff that we have to do, but there is nothing that we have to do, because there are these two really, really amazing words in our life that for our whole life, we either allow things to emerge or we resist things. So if we let go of the resistance, if we set the intention for those things to come forth and for us to interact with them, to feel that, and it depends on how big it is, because there are people who've been through massive traumas and things like that, which it's not a matter of just flicking a switch and saying, okay, I'm just going to let that go. It is a process, because every moment of our life simply wants to be felt and experienced and released so we can move on. So every moment in our life, every experience wants to be completed so we can move on to the next moment complete. But when we don't know how to do that, when we weren't taught how to do that, or we have an experience that is so overwhelming that we simply don't have the ability and the skills and the understanding to deal with it, then it's a really, really natural thing to put it inside for later. And sometimes later for people means their whole life, right?
Yeah. And I suppose there's a tendency for seekers to, they're in a process of letting go of their ego. And if you're still in that process, you might be trying to do shadow work from a place of ego. And that's not really as effective as what you were talking about, where you set the intention and then
Mhm,
you let it happen. I've
mhm.
found that I've set the intention, but then I've been impatient about it actually resolving, and
Yes,
I've just got to let it happen
yes,
as it happens, right?
because you,
Because the higher self or whatever guides you through it.
yes, because when you talk about the impatient comes from your intellectual mind, from your personality, saying, I should be able to figure out and to know how to do this, right?
Hmm.
And that's not the place where this healing journey happens. It doesn't come from your intellect.
Yeah. So it's an interesting image you've got in the background there.
Yes, there was one that I designed.
So you've got a so how practiced are you at art like that, digital art?
I got a graphic designer to actually physically do it. So I came up with this design, showed him what I wanted, and then he made the digital image. So I didn't actually physically create the digital image. I just asked somebody to do it by giving them the drawings and whatever else of what I wanted.
It looks really fitting for what's happening at the moment.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that because once the PhD in me is established and up and running, there is a second part of the message and the impulse that wants to come forth from me. And that relates, like the PhD in me is very, very much about a personal journey and about a personal expansion and healing for people individually.
Right.
But the same thing needs to happen in the collective. The same thing needs
Oh
to
yeah.
happen with all of us in whatever groups we're in, whether those groups are families, whether those groups are cultural or political or nations. And ultimately, there is a word that binds all of us together in our activities, and that's the word business, because in one way or another, we're all connected through business in one way or another. And even if you say the business of life, and whatever it is that we do and however we connect with the marketplace, we are in business. And that symbol will be that image, that logo will be something that I want to bring forth in the area of conscious business, that takes the message that's in PhD in me, which is for the individual, and extrapolates from it a message that is designed for the collective, so that the collective go, because what I've observed is that anything that happens in the individual happens in the collective, and anything that you see and recognize in the collective, you can also see and recognize in the individual. So the healing and the expansion of our consciousness needs to happen collectively as it does individually.
Yeah. I would say so as well. It has to do with us as a whole rather than just us individually.
Yes.
And it reminds me of this principle in hermeneutics. Is that how you pronounce it? Hermetics.
Yes.
That this idea of as above, so below, as below, so above.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is a conversation that we could take in 100 different directions,
Yeah.
because there is so much wonderful fruit to dine on in taking that conversation in whatever way that it goes. But yes, I understand what you're saying.
So would you say, so what are the most important values or lessons that we can apply to business or perhaps even politics?
Well, I mean, I guess for me, we need to find them within ourselves first, because, you know, you don't have to look far around this world to see that our systems all of them are broken and don't serve us, don't serve humanity, and don't serve the planet anymore.
Oh yeah.
So, but the change that needs to happen is not going to come by force. It's not going to come by rioting and by fighting against what is broken, because the power in that sense always lies with the establishment and with those systems. But it starts with us individually living the change that we see and that we want and that we can imagine. So
Yeah.
on an individual basis, it's how do I live my life? What choices do I make? That's where the change starts. And then for me, one of the most important things is the conversations. So I love engaging in conversations like you and I have now. And yes, this is on a podcast, but I have this conversation with anybody and everybody who will listen, just simply to keep sowing those seed thoughts about what is possible and what the change is that can come and that can happen. And so that's where it starts. And it starts with us individually recognizing that when we arrived in this life, we arrived with no beliefs. We arrived as pure potential and pure love. We arrived with the potential to have any thought and any experience that is possible. And then, but we arrived in a world full of pain and full of trauma and full of conflict. And that world wanted to domesticate us. It wanted to teach us all of its learned beliefs. And so when we're in those early formative years, when we're like a sponge, we take on the learned beliefs of the tribe and the culture and the religion and the politics that we were born into. So if you and I had been born somewhere different, if we had been born into a Ku Klux Klan town in Southern America, or a Zulu village in South Africa, or a kibbutz in Israel, or any other place, we would have had the beliefs of that tribe and that culture and that religion put into us. And so the invitation that comes forth in the book is for us to realize I have learned beliefs, but I am not those beliefs. And so when I realize that, and then I start to find them and search for them, have a conversation with them and say, is this really true? Or are there other ways of looking at this? And does this belief really serve me? And if the answer is no, then I have the ability to choose to replace it with a different one. But the more consciously I do that, and the more I'm aware of that process, the more I can start to choose beliefs that serve me and that serve the collective, that serve humanity and the planet. And you know, I said that I was like a guinea pig or a lab rat. If you knew me, or if you were having this conversation with me 30 years ago, the Chris that would have been talking to you would have been diametrically opposed to who you're talking to now in every possible worldview and life view and every possible belief, right? I was the president of the World Skeptics Association. I just thought everything was woo-woo and bullshit and whatever else. And so I've gone through the process that I've just described to you consciously and intentionally. And there is this sense inside of me that if one little wood duck like me can transform that much in such a relatively short period of time, then 8 billion people can do the same. And I sense that the impulse to do that is in so many people these days.
Yeah, I've had a similar experience to some extent where I felt a similar sentiment where if I can do it, anyone can. Because I was so stuck in ego and so overthinking everything in a left brain way, right?
Yes.
I got so into that, and somehow I managed to find spirituality. You were the head of the skeptic organization.
And I wasn't literally, I was saying that figuratively, right? I wasn't
Okay.
actually, I was just saying I could have been if there was such an organization, which I think there is. So I wasn't really, but
Right. Okay.
figuratively speaking, that's what my attitude was.
So your point seems to be that we all come in here with a blank slate and are socialized by the society we're in. And it's up to us to question that and start a journey where we find truth for ourselves.
Yeah, socialized sounds like a really gentle word. I would call it more domesticated because
Conditioned or domestic. Yeah.
I picture it like a wild, free-spirited animal that is caught and put inside a paddock and taught how to live inside the confines. And so you can be happy and do what you want, but you have to live within the confines of this fence, which is like the confines of the learned beliefs that I was talking. As long as you're within that, that's fine. We'll give you some latitude, but don't you dare step outside that, because then you'll get slapped around and whatever.
Yeah, that certainly is something that happens. Though it's interesting because this brings us to the nature nurture debate.
Yes.
In my opinion, I would say that perhaps, I don't know for sure, but perhaps when we come into this life, we come in with with certain things our soul wants to achieve and a certain template or certain predispositions that might not be the same as other people's predispositions, even though, well, we're still socialized or conditioned or what you said,
Domesticated.
domesticated. Because after all, we all have our unique signature,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So how would you fit that into it?
I'm not sure what the question is. Like
Oh, okay.
what you're saying makes total sense to me, but what's the question?
You were emphasizing how we are domesticated and conditioned.
Yes.
You didn't mention how we might start off different and unique. However, I'm not going to say that you're ignoring that aspect of things or just asking about,
Well,
do you think we start with certain predispositions?
the uniqueness is inherently who we are. Like um, the energy signature that you talk about, the consciousness and energy that inhabits my body, which is who I really am. I'm not this body. That's just a vessel to walk around and get around and experience life in. So yes, there is that unique consciousness that came here to experience life. And part of the journey, like my personality is developed through those early years. And while people say and believe that, oh, we have a hard-coded personality, I don't believe that at all, because I've even watched my own personality change as my beliefs changed and as my values changed. So did my personality and how I expressed myself. So I don't believe any of that
Okay.
is hard-coded, right? Sorry, you were going to say something, Con.
Well, I feel like it can change definitely, and we can be conditioned and we can recondition ourselves because of brain plasticity, for example, and other aspects in which we can change. However, I'm interested in Jungian psychology, and there's this concept of archetypes, I suppose,
Mm-hmm.
and there's this investigation into personality.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose everyone have an ego, right? And I would say that maybe we choose the nature of our ego. And that's up to us to not let it rule us, but perhaps our ego is a tool that we can make use of in with different strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah. Now, bear in mind that everything that I will say to you is not in any way, shape, or form meant to be taken as the truth. It's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
my view and perspective at this moment, right? And my favorite understanding is to say that I don't know. Like, I start off being comfortable with the idea that I
Right.
don't know something, and then from there continue to expand. So I don't ever want to get to the point where I put my stake down somewhere and say, okay, I arrived, I know, because at that point it's like, well, the journey's over and I'm just waiting for entropy to set in and take my body, right? So I'm happy to share my perspective, but I also am constantly looking for the next opportunity to change my mind, to speak to people who will bring the next aha moment, the next understanding that allows me to expand some more, which is another way of saying change my mind, right? So
Yeah, you're making a good point.
the ego, like I see two really valuable purposes to what we refer to as the ego. It allows us to, in the first instance, experience ourselves separate from everything else, because at the level of our essence, we are one and the same with everything. Everything is
Yeah, yeah,
part of
definitely.
the same consciousness
Wow.
and energy. And so for me to experience life in this environment, in this paradigm, I need to be able to experience myself as separate from you, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
that creates human relativity. So it creates the fact that I need to be able to feel hot in order to recognize cold. I need to be able to recognize the absence of love, which we refer to as fear, in order to know the feeling of love. I need to know what sweet is in order to recognize sour or bitter, right? So that's human relativity. And my ego is a gift in order through which I experience this life as separate from everything else that I'm actually part of. But the curse is that the ego then takes over and wants to protect me from everything because it sees me as separate. And so it says, everything is potentially dangerous to you. I have to protect you from everything. And so in learning to recognize that, and I'm saying to my ego, no, there's no risk here. I'm perfectly safe. I have a total trust and faith in the essence inside of me. You don't actually need to protect me from anything, right? So this is part of the journey of this whole PhD and me concept, is learning to recognize that I don't need my ego to protect me from anything.
Yeah, and I guess everyone have that journey where we're we have the potential to let go of fear and perhaps even fear of death.
Yes, absolutely. That's the biggest one of all. Because when we get to the point that we realize that my birth was not the start of life, it was simply me arriving in a different dimension, in a different place to where I came from before. And death is not the end of life and is not the end of me. So as I come to realize that, and the fear of death disappears, again, my whole experience of life changes.
Yeah, so would you say it takes bravery or just letting go?
Well, I didn't feel any bravery in that journey. It was an expansion process. It was letting go of disbeliefs. Like we don't just have beliefs, we have disbeliefs, right? So the two go hand in hand. We have lots of unhelpful beliefs that are perhaps not serving us so well, and then we also have lots of disbeliefs, and it's a matter of finding both of them and yeah, choosing to let them go.
Right. So that that definitely sounds that makes sense. So I'm wondering about the state of humanity at the moment, the state of the world, how much division there is, how much conflict. how many people are so, they're having egoic reactions to things
Yes.
rather than
Having fear-based
being mindful.
reactions.
Yeah, we're seeing this. I don't know if it's happening more or less per se, but it seems that something perhaps is dysfunctional psychologically on a mass scale. And how would you how do you explain that?
Um, very carefully, because I don't readily feel qualified to explain it. So I can give you a couple of thoughts, and again, with the overriding comment that I know nothing, right? And I'm totally comfortable with knowing nothing, but I have a view and a perspective and an understanding of most things at this moment. But what I recognize is that the view and the perspective and the beliefs that I had a year ago are different to the ones that I have today. And I know that what I'm sharing with you right now is different than if we had this conversation in 12 months' time, right? So
Yeah.
the invitation for people is to realize that. And at that point, at what point should I then ever defend what I'm saying or what I see and recognize as the truth, when I know and I can witness and observe that it's constantly changing and evolving, right? For me to get into an argument with somebody and say, you're wrong and I'm right, would almost put me in the category of being insane, when I know full well that my view is constantly changing and evolving. So just alone the understanding of that eliminates all conflict. You can't have conflict anymore if you don't have a need to be right. If I don't need to be right, if what I'm sharing with you, I'm sharing because I can and because I value the conversation, but I have nothing attached to the outcome of whether you agree or whether you have the same opinion and you understand what I'm saying. So at that point, there is no scope for there to be any conflict anymore. So, you talked earlier about politics and about everything that's happening in the world. The first thing is coming to a realization that our purpose here is to expand, is to make known the unknown, for me to discover thoughts and ideas and concepts that I didn't know before. And knowing full well that what I have learned up to this point, there is an infinite amount more for me to learn, right? And so
Yeah.
coming back to your question about what's happening at the moment, I feel and I sense and I'm observing that there is a major shift happening in human consciousness. We've gone through 100 years of massive increase in our technology. And what I've observed is that our technology has gone from here to here, and our consciousness has gone to about there. And the two are completely out of sync and out of whack. The expansion of our consciousness has not happened in the last 100 years at the same rate that our technology has expanded, right? And so it's totally out of whack. And the consequences of that we can see everywhere. So there is, in my view, and I'm coming in contact with and meeting more and more people who are demonstrating and showing me that impulse to shift to a higher level of awareness and understanding. And it brings to mind the science of somatics. Do you know what somatics is?
Rings a bell. What is it?
It's the science that puts into visual form sound. And so,
Oh, yeah,
as
that's
an example, if you get a thin sheet of flat metal and you sit it on top of a speaker that music comes out of, right? And on top of that sheet of metal, you put some iron filings. And then you film the whole thing. So as you blast some sound or put some sound through that speaker, the frequency of that sound causes those iron filings to come together in a geometric shape. And that geometric shape is a representation of the frequency of that sound energy.
right. And it's a sort of divine geometry linked to
It's
frequency, right?
absolutely universal geometry, and yes, and it is putting the frequency of that sound into a physical shape. But the fascinating thing is that if you then increase the frequency that's coming through that speaker to a new and higher frequency, right, that shape will change. But if you film that process in slow motion, what you see is that those iron filings, first of all, disperse from the shape they were in and go into complete chaos before they reassemble into the new shape of the higher
Oh,
frequency.
oh, I
And
see what you're saying.
right, so
Sorry, I'll
we
let you
have
finish.
a planet at the moment in complete chaos, and humanity and all of our systems, there is so much chaos everywhere, and it's a recognition that we are going from an old lower level frequency to a higher one. Now there are many people who are resisting that change and who are saying, bugger this, I don't like change, I'm sticking to my old beliefs and my old way of doing things and whatever else. But then there's another group of people who are embracing that and who are recognizing it and who are saying, wow, this is such an amazing journey. And I guess I put myself into that group of people.
Yeah, that that makes a lot of sense to me. It reminds me of how if an individual wants to make changes in their life, for an individual to make changes, sometimes it requires a big shake-up. And for a
Yes,
while, they won't know heads or tails of it, and it will be a bit chaotic, a bit more stressful.
yes,
And but then they can actually make some necessary changes so that their life can get better. And that's been happening for me. And I feel like, well, the individual level is a microcosm of the macro level, and it just seems like the same process,
it is.
just on a large scale.
Yes, it is exactly that. Exactly that. You're 100% right.
I love that way of looking at it. Yeah. It's so simple too. It's not this super analytical explanation. It's just so simple.
Yes.
I like how you explain things like that. So do you feel like we're close to a breakthrough, or
I have
perhaps
no
they're even?
idea. I have no idea. I, I,
Oh,
I
okay.
don't know, and
Yeah, that's the secret. We don't know.
I can't picture what is coming next and what it's going to look like. I just have this wonderful sense and intuition and trust that we are moving towards a wonderful new way of interacting with each other on this planet and with the planet, whatever else. And it's allows me to stay full of joy and full of optimism in the midst of the chaos that we see at the moment.
Yeah. So, what would be your advice to listeners about how to navigate this chaotic time?
I guess from my own journey, one of the most valuable things I discovered was the connection between my outer self and my inner self, between my essence, my intuition, and my personality and my ego. So there's the part of me that's experiencing life, and there's the part of me that's observing life. And the part of me that's observing life knows everything, and the part of me that's on the outside knows nothing. And so the real guidance for me I have learned to listen to that inner voice and that intuition. But the world shouts and that inner voice whispers. And so my advice is to learn how to quieten your life and how to quieten your mind, because what emerges is just amazing. And for many people, they hear something coming from the inside, but it scares the living daylights out of them. So they turn the volume up and they get more and more distractions and more addictions, so that, heaven help me, I don't have to listen to what wants to speak to me and to emerge from the inside. So the advice is allow yourself to go on that journey of connecting the outer part of you experiencing life with the inner part of you that's observing it, and watch what emerges.
So we can be more of a whole, I guess.
Yes, exactly. Because that's a partnership that is meant to be there. And that when that partnership is actually functional, then what emerges is just this permanent state of inner peace, where stress is no longer the normal emotional state. You may occasionally get triggered by something and whatever else, but those are rather the exception than the rule. Whereas that normal feeling of inner love, peace, and joy actually becomes your default state. And gosh, that's a wonderful way to feel, to experience life.
Well, it must be. I've made progress. I've been doing meditations, but you definitely seem like you've got there. It reminds me of how Eckhart Tolle describes it. And so how did you learn to quiet your mind?
It just came over time. And I think it came with the curiosity. It came with the realization, and I've listened to Eckhart and I've listened to so many different people. And I came to the realization that every person who touches my life has something of value for me to learn if I'm open to hearing it, right? But I also learned that the age of the guru is behind us, that we are meant to come into the age of self-mastery. I'm not meant to look at another human being as being superior to me and smarter than me and whatever else. I'm meant to look at the beggar in the street and the 2-year-old child in the same way as I look at a president of a country or a high profile teacher or speaker. They all have something of value for me to learn, but the guru lives inside of me, not out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And if everyone's got a soul within them, even a child can have a surprising wisdom, or even an animal, or who knows, perhaps a chair or something.
When you say even a child,
Oh, oh, yeah,
I've
you're right.
learned, I've learned to look at that in such a different way, because there is so much wisdom in children. And the silly thing is that our culture has taught us that it's adults who know things and kids are supposed to be seen and not heard. And so all of that wisdom from little children is far too often suppressed. And their expression of how they came to express life is not allowed to emerge. And so again, they go through that whole process of being shut down. So little children are the first place that I look for answers. In fact, I'll give you an example. I've had the privilege of raising a blended family with 11 children. And I raised 6 children earlier on in my adult life when I was still a different person to who I am now. I gave them all of the loving and the caring and the nurturing, but I still believed that it was my role to teach my children, right? But what we as adults teach them is all of the learned beliefs that we learned. And most adults are going to therapists and to God knows what to help with all their issues, but at the same time they're teaching all those issues to their children, right? And I was
Oh,
I
right.
was guilty of that as well. But then later on in my life, my youngest daughter came along, and I was in a very, very different space in terms of my consciousness, awareness, my beliefs. And I noticed something really, really early, is that by the age of 2 or even earlier, she was really, really expressing her pure love and joy for life and being alive. She would sing and dance and laugh and giggle. She would sing songs, not that she had learned, but that she just made up. So the words and the melody came out as she was singing them. And she didn't care if anybody liked it. She didn't care whether people thought it was good enough. And every person who she saw was a friend and an opportunity of somebody to laugh with and to say hello to. And I realized by watching her that that's actually how we all arrived in this world. We arrived
Yeah.
here to love life and to express our joy of life. And then all of that was suppressed, and we were taught the power of no, and don't do this and don't do that, and you mustn't do this, and whatever else. So her mother and I very early on made a conscious decision to teach her nothing, to nurture her and keep her safe, but to allow her to express who she came to be. Now, when I say learn nothing, I don't mean that literally, because we taught her, whatever it was that normal day-to-day life teaches you. But she also taught me that children don't learn by what we tell them. Children learn by watching how we do life, and they observe how we do love, how we do anger, how we do stress, how we do um, joy, how we do money, how we do religion, how we do sexuality. They don't learn by what we tell them. They learn by observing it. And so what most children observe from their parents is a stressed life full of how do I survive? How do I get through this? And people who are, massively stressed, massively in debt, massively medicated, trying to survive. And at the same time, they're trying to teach their kids how to live a wonderful life. And their kids are saying, well, it doesn't matter what you tell me. I'm just learning by watching you. Right.
And
And so,
that's, it's
yeah.
kind of sad the way we're taught to, well, actions speak louder than words a lot of the time. So if you're being taught by your parents effectively all this fear, all this stress, or if they, arguments and so forth, it's no wonder that generation after generation we get the same patterns.
Yes. Yes.
Perhaps it can change now.
Yes.
And it's fascinating the way you describe how your parenting approach with her. And the other thing is that we're meant to be more like that. We're taught to worry about what other people think. And
Yes.
we need to learn to unlearn all of those domestication
Yes.
processes.
Yes.
Where do you think it ultimately comes from, though?
What?
The domestication.
It's been, well, it's been passed from generation to generation for thousands of years. The history and the origin of that is a rabbit hole that we don't have time to go down now. And part of the curiosity is that you can find people, I mean, I'll throw a name out there, someone like Greg Braden or Nassim Haramein. If you start listening to learned people like that, you will come up with ideas and thoughts about the answer to that question. But yeah, this we don't have the time, nor do I have the level of expertise to really answer that question.
Right. An answer I've come to is that we can pin external blame on all kinds of dark forces or what have you.
Yes.
And that's certainly, there's all sorts of rabbit holes that people go into, but we have responsibility for submitting or not submitting, like, and for how we behave and teach the next generation. Humanity can't just say it's this group or that group that are to blame for why everything's wrong, because
Yes.
that's fundamentally some kind of projection, especially if we've got all within us in a sense.
Yep.
So where do we
We've
go from here?
covered, well, we've covered lots of wonderful ground today. We're probably at a point where I don't know if you feel complete, but I feel like we've covered some wonderful ground.
Was anything you feel would be good to add?
No, no, I as I said, I feel complete with where we've gone with this conversation.
Well, it did go. It was pretty interesting, and I suppose we don't need to have it be 2 hours or something. It's
No,
yeah, it feels complete to me as well. It was very nice having you on. It's You're pretty interesting and you're pretty at peace with yourself. And that's something we can all learn from. Well, we can all learn from each other anyway, but
yes, 100%. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for spending this time with me. I've enjoyed it immensely.
all right. Then so listeners, this was Chris Tazreiter
Tazreiter,
and from
Australia,
yeah,
down under, the great southern land.
yeah, that's one way to put it. All right. Then goodbye for now. Maybe we'll have you on another time.
Thank you, Nick. All the best.
Yeah, you too. Bye.